Today I'm going to be talking about systemic energy. Now, the self as a system has many parts, or the self is part of a system, a whole, that has many parts, the self being a part of it. And there's organization. When there's systems, there's organization, how things adjust, interact, and there's consequences that affect the fitness and therefore the survival based on factors that can occur. So sometimes we rely very heavily on our predictions based on the past, on what will happen to the system and how it's organized. And we have a lot of biases, and I'm going to speak about them. First of all, I'm using a lot of information from a book called The Ascent of Money by Neil, I don't even remember anymore, already a couple weeks, but it's called The Ascent of Money. And there's other sources I use. I'll try to remember to speak of them, but for the most part, this is my own comments or inspired a lot by what I read in his book. And so there's these scientists, Kalman and Tversky, I believe, and they found that loss has a 2.5 impact of a gain of a same magnitude. In other words, if you lose 2.5, if you lose $1, it has an effect on you 2.5 times more than if you gained $1. What does this cause? This causes risk aversion for positive prospects. So we'll say, well, I could prevent myself from losing this. I will be happy to get less, even if I want more, just because there's more protection from loss. And on the other side, we will kind of like seek risk when there's negative prospects. So, for example, it's not worth it to make $1 if I could lose so much money, so I'd rather, basically we are more likely to risk what we have or risk potential gains if it means we don't lose anything right away. So the idea of a loss is relating on average to how much I have and how much I'm willing to risk of what I have versus whatever the resource is. It could just be attention or time, but whatever it is, could be a collector's item, could be, beauty products. If lending it to this friend means I won't get it back, I probably won't lend it, but does that mean I'll risk the friendship? So we tend to have that kind of angle of thinking where we're looking at our risks. We kind of are seeing what we gain from it. If there's not much to be gained, we're less likely to risk losing. And then I'm going to speak now about some biases. These are many famous biases, and I'm just going to explain them very simply, and you could see which stick out to you, but they're pretty common. They're called skewed modes of thinking and learning. Learning is new information for educated guesses and knowing facts about the world. So heuristic means like jumping. It means intuitive. It's kind of like a quick knowledge answer without like an educated guess, but really like puzzle solving. It doesn't necessarily follow every single fact. And our brains do this a lot, and it helps us save time and energy from having to like actually put everything next to each other and see if it fits. We just kind of like say, I think it should fit, or when you're preparing food, you kind of like guess, or whatever it is, unless you take it very seriously in whatever area. But we all have areas where we kind of like, not necessarily find shortcuts, but kind of blur the edges a little just for the sake of being close enough, So these are some ways, not to say we can't trust ourselves, but that when we're looking at how it impacts the system, there's consequences that we cannot predict so accurately. And so I'm going to read them now. One is the availability bias, which is a base decision on readily accessible information versus your needed information. So whatever's kind of like, you kind of guess based on what's available, not like the information that you might need to make the decision. If people are telling you what brand is best, and then it's like, well, I do need to get that service, so like, that's the information I was told. Hindsight. We attribute higher probability to an event after it occurs. The same thing we might say, right before, you might say, how likely is this event? And you'll give your answer, but you are going to say it's way more likely that something like that should happen after it has happened, even if it wasn't as likely, or you would have said it's less likely before it happened. Not to say that, it isn't probable or it is probable, but to say that the mind that's assessing the information is making an incomplete analysis or appraisal. A problem of induction is formulating general rules based on insufficient information. This is what we might call racism. It fits into this category. It's like somebody yelled at you and you happen to be, Indian, and now you think that all brown people, or, somebody yelled at you and they're Afro-Caribbean, and now you think all Afro-Caribbean people, or somebody yelled at you and they were Asian, you don't even know what kind, and then you say, oh, this person is like this. And so whatever it is, you just kind of like assume generally. And another one is fallacy of conjunction, also called disjunction, and it's overestimating the probability of multiple events at high probability all occurring, but underestimating that even one of multiple events at a low probability. So you would say, let's say 7 events have a high probability of occurring at 90%, and you would say, oh, all of them, because it's already 90%, you just assume all 7 are going to happen. But that on the other side of it, again, with that loss idea, similar to this, we make the assumption on the other side that 10% we assume doesn't even matter, that it's for sure going to happen, but we underestimate that even one of multiple events, they say it's only 10% chance that these 7 things will happen, and you assume none of them will happen. So this kind of bias of they could happen, they could not happen, but we're making assumptions that are false because of the angle we're looking at it. There's confirmation bias, which is looking for proof of initial idea versus any evidence that might falsify it. It's also called cherry picking, when you seek out things to confirm what you know versus being open to new information. Contamination effects are irrelevant, but proximate information influences the decision. So, for example, we know the word contamination, but you'd say somebody who is fasting for many days and getting a lot of information from their body, and they only eat something very small in the evening, if they're around people eating all the time, they will not be able to distinguish some of the information from their body versus the feedback from people around them about what they love and what's tasty. And, we might even say sugar's terrible because look at how it affects that person. Every time they eat it, they get in a bad mood after. But that might not be exactly how that person's body might react. So just because it's available. So that's 2 examples of contamination and actually using food. So scope neglect prevents from proportionally adjusting what we should be willing to sacrifice to avoid harms of different orders of magnitude. So we might say, like, again, bringing back that loss. So afraid of loss that we won't even gain a little or risk losing. And this is another way of looking at it is you might say that experiment with children where they said if you don't eat this marshmallow for a few minutes, you'll get 2. And some of the children ate it, some of the children didn't, but they were willing to lose a marshmallow just to make sure they got it. But if you had said, let's say, for example, I will give you 2 marshmallows. If you eat both, you will not get 5 later. It wouldn't be possible for them to understand this 5 marshmallow is more than double. And you get 5, and there's 2 here now, especially after you just had 1. So it's this proportions start to change because, even personally, it's like how much time goes into getting driving lessons and how much freedom comes from it, but how much I'm willing to sacrifice. It's a different order of magnitude. Maybe I'll save so much time by getting everywhere quickly, by putting in some time now. So whether it's marshmallows or driving lessons, it's whatever it is, the scope is not accurate. Then we have something called affect heuristic, which is preconceived value judgment, interferes with the assessment of cost and benefit. Maybe we are attached to certain modes of pleasure, pain, and it affects us. So we've already formed our opinions, and we're not going to be open and assessing actual information. Another is called overconfidence and calibration. This is when we underestimate the confidence intervals with which estimates would be most robust. In other words, we say best case scenario is most probable. We are assuming that what we want to happen is most likely going to happen. And we're not looking at it from a detached perspective, seeing the truth of the likelihood. And finally, bystander apathy. And this is abdicate individual responsibility in a crowd. Just like the idea that there's someone screaming outside your house. I keep talking about screaming a lot today. And everybody just kind of ignores it because it's such a busy neighborhood. Or you see a kid fall down, but there's so many adults around that you don't even ask the kid if they're okay. But nobody asked the kid if they're okay. Or nobody went to see what about the person screaming. So we don't look at ourselves as part. We look at ourselves as part of a whole, but like the loss of going to help is not necessary because there's not much to gain because there's so many other people who may be more appropriate to interact with the situation. And this is the idea of why isn't anyone doing anything? But actually, most of us in those situations are doing something. We're looking around and we're seeing if anyone else is reacting, and we're trying to act poised and unflustered, especially when it's scary. And finally, I'm going to say the surprise of the future is confidence, optimism, pessimism, gambles, programming from movies and TV, and fear of frantic powerlessness. So some mix of this, mix of your confidence, how much you believe in yourself or in the other people you're relying on, whether it's family or teachers, your optimism or your pessimism, which is kind of like, let's say, the temperature of your outlook. Do you think it's going to be dry and not manifest, or do you think it's going to be wet and overflowing with good? Gambles, and goes back to how much you're willing to risk. Do you play it like a game, or do you get really passionate? This is how much you could be surprised by the future. Programming from movies and TV is what's normal to you. We have a lot of sci-fi out. We have a lot of fantasy. So if you saw something that you would normally maybe in the past think it was insane, but now you've seen it in a movie, you're less likely to be surprised. And also fear of frantic powerlessness. You're less likely to want a surprise where you're going to be humiliated or uncomfortable in some way. And so you will be prepared for situations where you won't feel powerless or frantic, but your ability to be open to what it feels like to be frantic or powerless will cause you to be in situations where you would have higher risk and then be able to experience more surprise. And now, what is all this for? This is for survival of the fittest. Because why are we predicting? We're trying to get by. We're trying to be okay. We're trying to make sure we don't lose anything. So this applies to systems, families, but also individuals. Because we have these genes, which are the organizational memory passed down from one individual to another. And we would say even in companies, you have staff. The individual has a rod, a staff. You know, the company is your staff. It's like an extension of you. And then we would say even a firm, like a real big company, you'd say it's a firm company. It's firm. You could stand on it. It's foundation. And this allows for spontaneous mutation. It has a potential, which means things will flow or things will drift. Some things will kind of like go away and some things will flow in more. And it also allows for innovation, which is culturally primarily and nationally and internationally for civilization. It's mostly technology that is possible for us. We keep having new inventions, but this innovation of when we are able to predict for the future or when we don't, we're able to adapt quite quickly to situations without having to control every little aspect so that we're not uncomfortable. And then there's competition between individuals within a specific group or different parts of the self for resources with outcomes, and this is why, is because you get to be around longer and make more of yourself or have more of your reflection in the world. And it determines which system or self or individual and the practices associated with it, the habits that interact with the environment in a beneficial way, will persist. And this is like where we might say it comes in the selfish gene. The ones who are very happy to be self-serving might be around and there's dominance, but I've talked in previous videos about power struggles and how being in charge actually causes a lot of stress on the system, because what do you have to start to do? You have to predict everyone else's moves. So having a selfish gene, well, for me, means you now have to look at all your competitors. And if you're dominant, you have to constantly assert yourself no matter what happens. You also cannot rely on being a bystander, or you have to be really careful about your risks, because if you lose some of your firm or staff or, individual memory at any moment that supports you, you may not have any mechanism by which to be selected naturally by the environment. So being over-dominant, overcompensating doesn't help, and having too much of a selfish gene doesn't help either, especially when there's a social aspect where each one interacts or organizes itself in a sufficient way where it fits together. And this mechanism for natural selection through systemic or self allocation of resources is what we call capital. So having enough to share to different parts, which give them all the ability to serve the whole, and the possibility of death when we underperform. So this is called differential survival. There's a difference in outcome of whether you survive or not based on whether you're naturally selected, what you put out is beneficial, and what you need is provided. So the scope for speciation and the scope for extinction, so the division, speciation means parts divide, and extinction means parts die, they collapse in on themselves. And this is true for institutions, groups that disappear, many companies, but then it's also true like when things divide, that it sustains diversity through the creation of new parts and new institutions that may be better use. And there are features to this. So various pieces join together into one trunk. New in evolution, we call it flora and fauna, which is plants and animals. I'm oversimplifying, but it's new creations that are of the natural world and of the walking or mobile world, and they spring up after a crisis, and after a radioactive disaster or a forest fire, a lot of new stuff grows from the ground and actually is super vibrant and super filled with a will to live, like it's pushing through the concrete idea. And then we have some rapid and nimble agile, which are like the escape artists or the ones that get the stuff quick. And then others are large and slow moving and regulated. And you could see this in the self with different parts, and you could see this outside with environment, groups, governments, I would say law enforcement, which is extension of government, and then of course also psychology, providers, mental health, physical health providers, and any other kind of supermarket or services like taxi, like all groups, all organizations fit into this parts in a whole, but also each one is a whole with parts. And we kind of absorb each other. There's this idea that one, like food chain in evolution, so one eats and absorbs the other. And some companies take on new names and take on all the other babyier companies. Not babyier companies, but they spawn a new self, but really they've absorbed many other smaller companies. And then there's 10 to 20% rate of creative destruction or extinction. And this means that there's let's say you have 100 aspects. 10 to 20 of them will disappear for the sake of new life. So this is the creative destruction element. And we have descent equals ascent. So a descendant can ascend. So descent and ascent. So the ascent of money is also the descent of money. It's the ascent of credit, for example, what money represents, that it's worth something, is also, the more money goes up, the more the actual value of everything goes down, because now you have more money, but each part of it is worth less. And it's not the fault of the mirror if it reflects blemishes as clearly as beauty. So if the value goes up and you like it, it's not any different than when the value goes down and you don't like it. And it's not the money's fault. It's not the value's fault. It's just, it's not the energy fault. It's not the patient's fault. It's actually an indicator of what's the internal state of what we're seeing from the outside. And finally, energy, which we can call here money, resources, anything with a value that you need to go on through the world and do well, is not a monster to be put in its place and control it, but actually it's a mirror for us as humanity. It reveals constantly the way we value ourselves and the world's resources around us. And so it shows us where our predictions are not perfect, because we may have set ourselves up for getting all these things and then we don't get it and we're so disappointed, and it also shows us that we're afraid to lose. So if we let go a little bit of being afraid to lose, we might get a lot of great surprises. And at the same time, a surprise could be death or really going very downhill if we don't respect the system. If we don't respect the system and we're either too selfish or not selfish enough, we may not be around long enough. And so finally, I'd like to wish you, with the sense of openness that comes from doubting some of these predictions of the future, and instead aligning oneself to be a whole with many parts, and also and that there's competition for who gets attention inside and outside, and also being a part of a whole and seeing where we can get more of what we need from whatever's available, and also give back, what we can't use, and become more comfortable with creative destruction, where parts of us have to go so that new parts can come. Wish you well.